You are holding a document that says you are a success. It records your home, your savings, and your stake in the world's greatest economy. You feel untouchable, a master of your own destiny in an era that has finally promised to banish poverty forever. But look closer at the ink. You aren't holding a record of wealth. You are holding a countdown to your own erasure. Every asset you own is actually a tether, and every dollar you've saved is a liability waiting to be weaponized against you by the very system that sold you the dream. In a matter of months, the instruments designed to build your future will turn into engines of extraction, pulling the floor out from under your feet to satisfy a debt you didn't even know you owed. To understand how this trap is set, we must go back to a quiet porch in 1928, where a man is about to discover that his fortune is actually a death warrant. We are taught that the Great Depression was a sudden storm or an act of God. This is a comfortable fiction. It suggests that if we simply avoid irrational exuberance, we are safe. But the historical record reveals something far more calculated. The catastrophe of the 1930s was not a failure of the market alone. It was a failure of a specific design. In the 1920s, the financial establishment promoted a philosophy called the New Era, which suggested that the creation of the Federal Reserve and the rise of industrial efficiency had permanently cured the business cycle. This was the narrative of democratization. It was the idea that every foreman and clerk could finally own a piece of the future. Think about what that means. When wealth is democratized through credit rather than capital, the participant does not become an owner, they become a tenant of the system. There is a fundamental difference between ownership and access. Access can be revoked at any moment. The ledger in Arthur's hand was not an inventory of assets. It was a list of leveraged bets that relied on a single and fragile condition. That condition was the continuous expansion of credit. When that expansion stopped, the very instruments designed to build his wealth turned into vacuum cleaners. They did not just stop growing. They began to extract every cent of liquidity from the middle class to satisfy a system that was suddenly starving for cash. This is not a theory. This is documented structural mechanics. We are going to dismantle the 5 specific traps hidden in that ledger. We will see how stocks and investment trusts and real estate and utility bonds and even bank deposits were engineered to feel like pillars of safety while functioning as engines of destruction. Each one was a layer of a paper pyramid that required total liquidation once the music stopped. To understand why Arthur loses everything, we must look past the headlines of the crash and into the machinery of the debt. Let me be precise about the first mechanism. It is the one everyone thinks they understand, but almost no one respects. We begin with the margin trap. To understand why the ledger in the hand of Arthur was a death warrant rather than a fortune, you must look at the mechanism of the margin trap. In 1929, the financial industry marketed a concept called the 10% rule. This was a system of leveraged acquisition, which simply means buying something with money you do not actually have. If Arthur wanted to buy $1,000 worth of stock, he did not need $1,000 in cash. He only needed $100. The remaining $900 was provided by a broker through what was called a call loan. Think about what that means. A call loan is a debt that can be demanded in full at any moment, usually within 24 hours. The broker was not a lender in the traditional sense. He was a middleman who borrowed that money from a bank at a floating interest rate. As long as the stock price went up, the system felt like a miracle of wealth creation. The $100 of Arthur was controlling $1,000 of assets. If the stock rose 10%, Arthur doubled his money. This is the illusion of the new era, the belief that the lever only works in one direction. But the lever is a tether. When the market dipped in October 1929, the mechanics of the margin call were triggered. A margin call is a structural requirement for the investor to provide immediate cash to cover the loss in value of the collateral. If the stock dropped from $100 to $90, The 10% equity of Arthur was gone. The broker, facing his own debts to the bank, did not wait for a recovery. He executed a forced liquidation. He sold the shares of Arthur into a falling market to protect the $900 he had borrowed. This created a feedback loop of destruction. Every forced sale drove prices lower, which triggered more margin calls, which led to more forced sales. The system was designed to protect the lender at the absolute expense of the participant. You might assume that this was only a risk for those playing the stock market and that the safety of a family home offered a different kind of security. We have regulations today to prevent this kind of volatility. That is true. And we will examine exactly what those protections mean. But first, we must look at the second trap in the ledger. Because for Arthur, the walls of his bungalow were built on the same shifting sand as his stocks. The mechanics of the margin trap were not merely a mathematical possibility. They were a physical wrecking ball that swung through every street in America. On October 24, 1929, the ticker tape fell 4 hours behind the actual trades. In brokerage offices from Wall Street to the quiet parlors of Detroit, the frantic clicking of the machines was the sound of a social class being erased in real time. This was the moment the new era met the reality of the ledger. Arthur was not an isolated victim of bad luck. He was one of millions caught in a feedback loop that the system was never designed to stop. Consider the case of the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation. It was launched in late 1928 at $104 a share. It was marketed to foremen and clerks as a vehicle of professional management and diversified safety. The public believed that the experts had finally mastered the volatility of the market. Failure was unthinkable until it happened. By 1932, those shares were trading at $1.75. This was a 98% extraction of value. It was the total evaporation of the reserves of the middle class to satisfy the debts of the institutions. This destruction was not limited to the stock tickers. It moved into the physical world. Between 1929 and 1933, the industrial output of the United States was cut in half. This is not a statistic. It is the story of the textile worker in North Carolina, whose weekly wage was slashed to $5 before the mill gates were chained shut. It is the story of the Kansas wheat farmer who watched the price of a bushel fall below the cost of the seed, while his interest-only mortgage remained fixed at the peak of the boom. 9,000 banks collapsed during this period. $140 billion in personal deposits vanished. The carnage was so absolute that it forced the creation of a new architecture. In 1933, the Glass-Steagall Act was passed and the FDIC was established. For the first time, the state guaranteed the safety of the deposit. It felt like the arrival of a permanent solution. But as we will see, a new wall was being built exactly where the old one had collapsed. Now you might say that the tragedy of Arthur was a result of his own choices. You might argue that if he had simply ignored the siren song of the stock market and focused on his home, he would have been safe. After all, a house is a physical reality. It is a shelter. It is the ultimate anchor of the middle class. This is the great sedative of the new era, the belief that physical possession equals financial immunity. But this is where the structural reality of the 1920s reveals its most predatory architecture. The bungalow of Arthur was not an asset he was slowly buying. It was a liability he was temporarily renting from a bank under a contract designed to explode. In the 1920s, the standard mortgage was not the 30-year fixed-rate instrument we recognize today. It was what economists call a non-amortizing balloon loan. Here is what that means. Arthur did not pay down the principal of his loan every month. He only paid the interest. The mortgage was typically a 5-year contract covering 50% of the property value. At the end of those 5 years, the entire principal amount known as the balloon was due in a single payment. During the boom years, this was not a problem. The bank simply rolled the loan over into a new 5-year term. It was a cycle of perpetual debt that felt like ownership, because the house was painted and the lawn was mowed. But in 1930, the liquidity trap closed. As the banks faced their own margin calls from the collapsing stock market, they stopped rolling over loans. They demanded the full principal immediately. Think about what that means. A foreman like Arthur, who had spent 5 years making every interest payment on time, was suddenly asked to produce several $1,000s in cash within days. He could not. Nobody could. The physical asset did not protect him. It became the very weight that pulled him under. Between 1930 and 1933, nearly 1,000 homes were foreclosed upon every single day in the United States. This was not a failure of the character of the homeowner. It was a failure of a specific financial design. The destruction of the life of Arthur followed a precise quaternary sequence. First, the banks froze his savings. Second, the brokers liquidated his stocks. Third, the factory terminated his wages. Fourth, the sheriff seized his home. Each step was a programmed extraction of liquidity. The statistics are devastating, but the mechanism is what matters. In 1932, the vacancy rate in industrial cities reached levels that suggested a civilization in retreat. The bricks and mortar remained, but the legal right to occupy them had been extracted by a banking system that was itself starving for liquidity. You were told that real estate was the bedrock of safety, but the bedrock was actually a paper contract with a hidden expiration date. If the house was not a sanctuary and the stocks were a trap, then we must ask where the real safety was supposed to be. We are taught that the final line of defense is the bank vault itself, the place where the cash is kept. But as Arthur walked toward the bronze doors of the Bank of United States in December 1930, he was about to discover the most terrifying secret of the entire pyramid. The vault was not full, it was empty by design. That was the theory. It is a narrative used to compartmentalize the Great Depression as a museum piece, a ghost of a primitive financial age. We tell ourselves that the digital ledger and the federal guarantee have rendered the tragedy of Arthur impossible. But here is what happened in practice in March 2023. In less than 48 hours, a financial institution with $200 billion in assets vanished. This was not a small immigrant bank. This was Silicon Valley Bank, the 16th largest bank in the United States. It did not fail because it was gambling on speculative bubbles. It failed because it was doing exactly what the regulators encouraged it to do. It was investing in the safest asset in human history. It was buying long-term United States treasuries. Think about what that means. The bank was caught in what economists call duration mismatch. This simply means they had locked their liquidity into long-term bonds that paid low interest, while their depositors could demand their money back instantly via a smartphone app. When interest rates rose, the market value of those safe bonds dropped. When the depositors began to withdraw their cash, the bank was forced to sell those bonds at a massive loss to provide liquidity. The bedrock of safety became a trap of insolvency. In 1930, it took weeks for a bank run to materialize through physical lines in the cold. In 2023, $42 billion was withdrawn in a single day through fiber optic cables. The speed has changed. The scale has changed. But the underlying architecture is identical. Failure was unthinkable until it happened in 1929. Failure was unthinkable until it happened in 2008. Failure was unthinkable until it happened in 2023. The pattern is no longer an observation. It is a law of structural mechanics. This is not a story about a specific bank in California. This is a story about the fragility of the entire global reserve system. When the collapse began, the federal government stepped in. They issued a systemic risk exception. They guaranteed every single deposit, even those far above the legal limit. It felt like a rescue. It was presented as a triumph of modern intervention. But there is a catch. Money is not created from a vacuum. It is a closed ledger. If the state guarantees the losses of a private institution, the liability does not vanish. It is simply transferred. It is moved from the balance sheet of the bank to the currency itself. This is the modern extraction. You are no longer watching a sheriff seize your bungalow. You are watching the purchasing power of your labor evaporate through the deliberate expansion of the money supply. The intervention that saved the bank is the same intervention that devalues your savings. The walls of your house are still standing, but the value of everything inside them is being liquidated in silence. This leads us to the most uncomfortable question of the modern era. If the system can only survive by breaking its own rules, who is actually paying for the stability? Anyone who tells you the rescue was free is selling you a version of the new era. The pattern is already in motion. We must now examine the final and most invisible trap in the ledger of Arthur, which has now become the ledger of every household in the developed world. And here is where the architecture of the new era reveals its final and most devastating layer. There is a specific moment when a civilization realizes its floor is actually a ceiling. For the 400,000 people standing in the slush outside the Bank of United States in December 1930, that moment arrived when the bronze doors did not open. This was the largest commercial bank failure in history to that point. It was not the failure of a small corner shop. It was the collapse of a pillar. But the name itself was the first mechanism of the illusion. It was a private institution designed to look like a government agency to harvest the trust of the immigrant and the working class. When those doors remained locked, the ledger in the hand of Arthur ceased to be a document and became a tombstone. This is the point where the separate traps we have discussed merge into a single engine of extraction. This is not conspiracy theory. This is structural analysis. The bank did not keep the cash of Arthur in a vault. It took that deposit and used it to fund the very margin loans and utility bonds and mortgages that were already collapsing in the streets. His savings were the fuel for the fire that was burning down his house. This is the definition of the liquidity trap. In a period of expansion, diversification feels like a safety net. You believe that if the stocks fall, the bank is safe, or if the factory slows, the house remains. But in a systemic crisis, all correlations go to one. Every asset class becomes the same thing. It becomes a forced sale in a market with no buyers. Think about what that means. The system had engineered a quaternary sequence of total liquidation. It had harvested the labor of the factory through wages that were never paid. It had captured the equity of the stock through margin calls. It had reclaimed the shelter of the bungalow through balloon mortgages. It had finally erased the security of the savings through the insolvency of the vault. The foreman in Detroit and the merchant in New York were holding the same paper promises. They were not owners of wealth. They were tenants of a credit system that required their total bankruptcy to reset its own internal imbalances. The institutional illusion of safety is the belief that a financial contract is a physical reality. It is not. A contract is a relationship of trust that is only valid as long as the counterparty is solvent. When the system fails, the contract does not protect you. It becomes the instrument used to process your loss. We are taught to view the Great Depression as a series of unfortunate accidents. But when you look at the mechanics of the ledger, it reveals itself as a sequence of legal transfers. The wealth did not disappear. It was repossessed by the architecture that created the credit in the first place. Arthur did not lose his future because he was reckless. He lost it because the safety he was sold was designed to evaporate exactly when he needed it most. The pattern is already in motion. We must now return to the street in Detroit to see what remains of a man when the ledger is empty and the music has stopped. So what does this mean in practice for the modern observer who recognizes the echoes of 1929 in the digital ledger of today? If the bank vault is a duration trap and the home is a leveraged liability, then the search for safety must move from the asset itself to the structure of the exposure. I am not recommending specific vehicles. I am documenting the frameworks that have historically allowed individuals to survive a systemic extraction. One response is the retreat into physical tangibility. This is the logic of holding assets like gold or physical currency outside the digital banking perimeter. The advantage is the elimination of counterparty risk. If you hold the asset in your hand, no bank failure or digital freeze can revoke your access. But there is a catch. Physical assets carry the burden of custody and the risk of theft or state confiscation. In 1933, the United States government made the private ownership of gold illegal for exactly this reason. Physicality provides a floor, but it also creates a target. Another framework is the diversification of jurisdiction. This is the strategy of moving capital across different political boundaries to ensure that a local systemic failure does not result in a total loss. The advantage is the decoupling of your survival from the stability of a single state or currency. But this introduces the complexity of international law and the friction of moving assets in a moment of crisis. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. The most fundamental shift is the transition from a tenant of credit to an owner of capital. This means the aggressive reduction of debt and the rejection of the margin account. The advantage is the removal of the tether that allows a bank to trigger a forced liquidation. But the limitation is the slow pace of accumulation. In a world engineered for debt, the unleveraged individual grows at a fraction of the speed of the crowd. There is no sanctuary that offers both growth and absolute immunity. You are choosing which risks you are willing to manage. The goal is to understand the mechanics of the traps before they close. As we return to the quiet street in Detroit, we see that for Arthur, the lesson arrived only after the ledger was empty and the music had stopped. It is now the winter of 1933. Return to the street in Detroit, but the sun is no longer setting over a quiet porch. Arthur is standing on Woodward Avenue. He is waiting in a line that stretches 4 blocks for a bowl of thin cabbage soup. He is wearing the same heavy wool coat he wore to the Ford plant as a foreman. But the brass buttons are gone. He sold them to a scrap dealer for 3 cents to buy a loaf of bread. The leather-bound ledger is also gone. It was burned in a kitchen stove to provide 20 minutes of heat for a house he no longer owns. As he moves forward in the slush, his boot sole flapping against the pavement, he sees a discarded copy of the Detroit Free Press. The headline announces the passage of the Glass-Steagall Act and the creation of the FDIC. It promises that the banks are now safe. It promises that the tragedy of the last 4 years will never happen again. Arthur looks at the headline and feels no anger. He feels only the cold clarity of a man who has seen the blueprint of his own destruction. He understands now that the rules were changed only after his life was used to pay for the lesson. Think about what that means for a man who did everything he was told to do. He recognizes that the safety he was sold in 1928 was not a shield, but a harvest. There is a fundamental difference between access and ownership. Access is a permission granted by a system of credit. Ownership is a fact of independence. Access can be revoked at any moment. For Arthur, the revelation arrived too late to save the bungalow or the shares or the savings in the vault. He is alive. He is sheltered in a boarding house. He is not among the worst off. But he is a ghost of the new era, a physical illustration of a structural law that most people still refuse to see. This channel exists to study the fractures before they become fault lines. We do not provide financial advice. We provide forensic analysis of the mechanisms that govern the modern ledger. To subscribe is not an act of consumption. It is an act of intellectual positioning. It is the decision to recognize the pattern before you are required to become the illustration. The architecture of extraction remains intact. The pattern is already in motion.